So Joey, can you like introduce yourself for the audience again?
Yeah, so I appreciate you having me on again. And so for those that maybe didn't listen to the first one, I'm currently entering my fifth season with the Memphis Grizzlies as a strength conditioning coach and a sports scientist. Before this, I worked in college, University of Wyoming. You really all sorts of sports, football, Olympic sports, and that's really where I got my feet wet. In addition to some other experiences, some other colleges. But yeah, so entering my fifth season, I handle all the sports science responsibilities with the Grizzlies, and then I'm one of our three strength conditioning coaches.
Cool. So besides basketball, which sport do you love the most?
Well, I wouldn't say I love basketball. I think there's a lot of opportunities to improve basketball players through training and through programming. I would say, I grew up wrestling my whole life, so I love combat sports. I would say that's probably like my favorite sport. But yeah, to like train, I really love the sport of basketball. Now I wish there was more of the wrestling culture in it, but it's an amazing opportunity to work with athletes. And like I said, I think because of the small population size, you have an opportunity to really move the needle. And that's not to say that people aren't doing an amazing job in other sports. Just sometimes when the team and the rosters get so big, it's hard to get super detailed with each athlete.
Nice, nice. So it's the fifth season you're in NBA. So um what's the difference in the fifth year and the first year?
That's a great question. There's a lot. I will say, I've been fortunate to be a part of really the same staff all 5 years. And so if you think about like a startup, right, the things that are going early on first, year, second year, it's super muddy. We're still trying to figure out how do we leverage each other's skill set the best? What are we trying to choose going forward? We'll try some, methodology for a couple months. Oh, that didn't work. And so you kind of are at this like inflection point now where all the trial and error, it's not to say it goes away, but we've sort of started to figure out what works for us. And that's not to say that same thing is going to work for others, but we've really figured out what works for us. So to directly answer your question, it's like the things we're doing now are just much more streamlined and effective, and we have more confidence in them as opposed to maybe earlier on that was a little bit grayer.
Nice, nice, nice. So uh like you mentioned, you're working at like the sports science stuff and also strength and conditioning. So how exactly do you balance these two roles?
Well, it's not easy, and in full transparency, I'm not sure you can be elite at both, especially at the same time. Fortunate for me is we have other practitioners who are outstanding strength conditioning coaches, physical therapists, athletic trainers, and that then allows, myself to really fulfill my sports science obligations to like the highest level, right? Um, if you're young, if you're a young practitioner, maybe listening to this, I do think doing both is an amazing way to improve your resume, improve the way you maybe see training, the way you see athlete care, athlete management. But in order to do that, you probably have to learn how to automate as much as you can. And that's something that really allows for improved balance because you're not spending so much time entering data or manually doing tasks. Let the software handle that. And then that allows you either to analyze at a deeper level or spend that extra time coaching. So I think that's how you at the very beginning, balance it, right? If you're young, you learn how to automate the stuff you can, you analyze the stuff you can't, and then you obviously spend that extra time learning, coaching, working with athletes. So and then as you go on, it I think it depends on the team you have. Like I said, we have an amazing group of strength conditioning coaches at our disposal, so I don't have to be the best strength coach or the expert in the room because I have them to turn to for ideas and methodologies. Now, I still have to be very effective for the athletes that I do work with. But that doesn't mean I have to have 10 guys, right? Because we have other people on staff. So I can go super deep on maybe the 3 to 4 guys I do have, do my sports science responsibilities, but having a team around me that's able to like pick up the areas and go super deep, that's I think how you build balance.
Nice. So, do you think that because like there's gonna be tons of coaches have like 20 or 30 years of like experience of like coaching, and at that time when they started, they don't have like force plate, they don't have GPS. So
Right.
exactly, I mean, um, to study a lot of like these and being able to like know what metrics you should use and what you should not.
Well, I think the technologies are just sort of confirming what these strength coaches have known for a long time. If you think about those, if you've been in it for 30 years, you're an unbelievable coach. You've seen more than I could have ever seen, right? And so think about something like VBT, right? VBT has obviously been around a long time, but this idea that as you approach, a failure velocity, right? So we have something to measure that now, but as you approach a failure velocity in an exercise, that is going to lead to a different adaptation than, let's say, exercise where you're moving the bar really fast, right? Without the technology, you can still program these things. You program speed stuff or you program max strength stuff. And that's what these strength coaches have done forever. We just have technology to sort of confirm that and maybe get a little bit more precise. And that's not to say that these older coaches are wrong. They were the first ones that were right. We're just maybe coming along and finding a more concrete way of analyzing it. You talked about force plates. It's like, obviously force plates have been around for a really long time. Now the commercialization of them has really exploded. But even before they were, really popular, you had greats in the field, Berkoshansky, Bondarchuk, like they're talking about these things in their books, and it's like, okay, they're talking about it, they've addressed it. There's papers that go back to the 60s and 70s on this stuff. Like I said, the VBT, we're just maybe making it more readily accessible. But I think those practitioners that have been in it like 30 years, I think they're still the experts and the people that we should be asking because their intuition may be telling us more than like the data is telling us sometimes.
Nice, nice. I love this. So last time we discussed a little about like force plate metrics. This
Mhm.
time I want to ask is about like what are the metrics you use to like track the workload for like a single training session or a long period of like the whole season?
Are you talking about in the weight room or on the court?
Both, kind of both.
Yeah, so we'll split that into two. In the weight room, we just based on our environment, it's difficult, right? We spend a lot of time on the road, a lot of time at home, and so some of the loading devices that we use are different, right? So it's like if I'm at home, we can maybe do, barbell, let's call it front squats, but we might not have a barbell on the road, right? So we only have machines. And then if we have machines on the road, it may be a techno gym leg extension, whereas we have a Kaiser leg extension. And so it becomes difficult to like coordinate like a annual plan in terms of like tonnage that maybe you would do in like weightlifting, like competitive Olympic weightlifters would do. With that being said, we still have tried to find ways, and we haven't mastered yet, but tried to find ways to better capture workload. So sometimes we'll think about like effective sets, right? So if you have maybe you're looking at like 8 to 12 sets per week for a given muscle group, that maybe gives you confidence that that tissue is prepared or that tissue is getting stronger or getting the right stimulus it needs to continue to grow. So that would maybe be an example of on the court or in the weight room. On the court, we have obviously since we have technology to measure this, it's in my opinion just a little bit more black and white. It's a little bit more concrete because if you're running It doesn't matter if it's on the court, in our practice court, in the FedEx Forum, which is where we play, or Madison Square Garden, right? The running's the running, the distance is the distance. So that's what makes it a lot easier to track. So we kind of break it up, right? Because if you think about basketball, the goal of load monitoring is, effective load management, it's mitigating injuries. And to do so, you need to understand like what are the injuries and why are they happening. In basketball, we see a lot less like acute muscle strains compared to maybe soccer or football. Just I think that's the nature of the sport, smaller field sizes. But you do see more, chronic degenerative stuff. You see, meniscus, and you see ligaments, you see chondral issues, bone stress injuries, right? You see these types of injuries maybe more than you would in soccer and football. So when you think about that, you want to think about, okay, what are the metrics that can give us some insight into how those structures are being loaded, right? Because it's the overload of those structures that typically is what causes the injury. So when you look at the court, you say, okay, well, I've got my, we use Kinexon, catapult stats, whatever your technology is that can give you an idea of workload on the court. We break it up into volume and intensity, right? Volume is how much they've done. Intensity is, the speed or the intensity of that session, right? So volume, we use distance, right? We use distance just because it's simpler than maybe some of the proprietary stuff that some of these technologies give. So we like distance. I think part of that too is before we had any game data, you could get distance from second spectrum from the cameras in game, right? So you have practice data, in-game data. Now we're fortunate to have both. So we use distance for volume. How much have they done? We then say, okay, well, how do we get an indication of intensity? How do we get an indication of how much force is going through those structures that I talked about before, right? And what we've settled on is we've said, hey, the activities on the court that sustain the highest ground reaction forces are probably putting the most stress on those tissues. So how do we get a metric? How do we get a proxy for that stress? And for us, we've settled on high accelerations and high decelerations. Now that's Kinexon's metrics. So basically they've said, when an athlete accelerates or when an athlete decelerates, they break it down into like low, moderate, and high. Okay. And we take the high accelerations, the high decelerations, and the high sprint efforts, and we combine those together and call them events. Right. So anytime you quickly accelerate, we say, wow, okay, that was probably a lot of force through those tissues. We want to know that. So that counts as like one event, right? One acceleration event. To get intensity, we sum all of those together to get an aggregate, and we'll look at that number by itself, but we'll also break it down into a per 30, right? So a per 30 minute, it just makes that number a little bit bigger and more digestible for coaches, for practitioners who may not be too familiar with, say, what mechanical load is, or sometimes when you're working with density, right? So per minute would be like would be density as opposed to intensity. And if those numbers get super small, it's confusing sometimes for those that are less informed to understand. So that's why we do per 30, just because it makes sense. So that's kind of how the court would work. We break into volume intensity. You could have a high volume and a low intensity session. You could have a high intensity, low volume session. You could have both. This is where maybe Bo's quadrant system would come in handy, because you can help bucket that stuff a little bit. But yeah, that's how we're tracking workload throughout the year, to give us an indication of how much and how intense our guys' sessions are, both practice and games.
Nice. I love this. Thank you for bringing up in so much detail.
Yeah.
So, to monitor, to manage, and to check the workload, is there like certain way you calculate like the acute chronic work ratio?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the acute chronic workload ratio is interesting. It's obviously been in hot water past couple of years, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, right? Because at the end of the day, we're just trying to get some idea of training stress balance, right? We're trying to get some idea of, okay, how much has the athlete done recently versus what they're maybe prepared for. And the huge chronic workload ratio came along at a time where we didn't really have a way to quantify that. And it was almost so simple that people grasped onto it and they used it for something that maybe it wasn't intended for, which was, injury prediction or injury mitigation. And I think that's where maybe we took a step wrong, but that doesn't mean it's not useful in any way, right? So if you think about even like RSI, the reactive strength index, it's a formula, right? It's an algorithm. Acute chronic workload ratio is a formula, it's an algorithm. Dynamic strength index, like any of these ratios that we're pulling from technology, there is some level of falsehood that comes along with them, right? But as long as you're using the tool for a specific reason, that might make it useful. And so how we use the acute chronic workload ratio is sort of as this like bumpers, right? If you think about like bowling, right? You're trying to avoid the bumpers, but when you hit them, you take a look at your, training load calendar and say, okay, where can we maybe pull workload from, or where can we add some stuff to? So in our season, we may have a week where we play 2 games and a week where we may play 4, right? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if I played 4 games this week and 2 games last week, the workload of this week is much higher, right? It's double than the previous week. Well, the acute chronic workload ratio is going to show that. It's going to quantify that. And it's not saying, oh, well, the athlete's going to get injured. It's just telling me, hey, these structures that we talked about before, right? These bones, ligaments, meniscus, whatever the tissues that you want to talk about, muscles even, they're overloaded compared to what they were the previous week. Now, hopefully that athlete's prepared for that, right? Prepared for that spike, because our best remedy against injury is greater preparedness. But if they're not, that gives us an idea of, hey, when we're building out next week's training plan, let's keep that in mind, right? Where, hey, maybe this practice that we had planned on Tuesday, let's pull that from a high session, maybe to like a low mod session. So what the acute chronic workload ratio does is it allows us to quantify what I just talked about, right? It allows us to quantify the athlete's most recent workload and a spike or not a spike compared to what maybe they're prepared for. And so we can then make adjustments, because we're also looking at a lot of different things. It's like if I have a dashboard, we're looking at, hey, what have they done in training? What are their basketball stats? Oh, they're dealing with foot discomfort. We got a lot of stuff. Acute chronic workload ratio is a nice number to get an idea of, hey, where is an athlete at this week relative to, say, the past month or so.
Nice. So can I replace it with like force plate data we discussed before, like reactive strength index or like eccentric peak force, that kind of stuff, to like monitor or to track where the athlete is right now?
Yeah, I don't think it's a replacement. It's probably a supplement, where if I have, let's say I have a trend line running of an athlete, right? And we're seeing, let's say we pick a metric that is what I would call load response metric, a metric that is pretty sensitive to changes in neuromuscular capacity. Well, what we typically would see, not always, because this is where the acute chronic workload ratio is not perfect, when that starts to, creep up a little bit, when what they've done recently is more than what they've done in the past couple of weeks, we may see an inverse relationship where those metrics might drop, right? So if we did pick eccentric peak force as that metric, we might see acute chronic workload ratio increase as that number decreases. Now, this is very conceptual. This doesn't always happen, but it may, right? Because an athlete, as they get tired, and we've seen this, as they get tired, as they get fatigued, eccentric duration slows, eccentric peak force drops, right? And that's also not to say that just because those numbers are going up doesn't mean they're not fatigued, but it's nice to be able to compare something that's maybe more like output driven, like the athlete, versus something that is bigger picture, maybe a month, if you think about 7 to 28 days, your acute chronic, looking at that relative to, hey, where is an athlete on a given day? What is the actual state of the system?
Cool. So After our last conversation, there's like Chris Bishop published the metric. I forgot the name of the paper, selecting the metrics that matters. And Daniel Bove just published his new book Takeoff recently.
Yeah.
So does these like the paper and the book change like how you view data or how you pick data?
Sometimes. I mean, I think, obviously those are two unbelievable practitioners. I think they're some of the best in the world. And so anytime they put something out, you have to say, okay, well, what am I currently doing? What are they proposing? And then like lay them on top of one another and figure out like, okay, where am I off? And in both resources, you do start to get an idea of, okay, is the metrics that Chris Bishop is recommending, are they similar to what I'm doing? Because they don't have to be the same, right? You just want to get close to, hey, if he's saying that these metrics are indicative of fatigue based on the research he's done, I want to make sure that I'm picking similar phases of a counter movement jump, that I'm picking similar like types of outputs. So is it force or is it time? Or is it a combination of both? Or is it derivatives of each? So, in that, and then if you look at Bove's book, I think we're on track, and like I said, that's not to say that there aren't opportunities for tweaking things. But we're also still at a very simple level. Like we're still not doing anything like super crazy where, yeah, eccentric peak force is eccentric peak force, really no matter where you are in the world. And so that makes it simpler as opposed to using maybe some like proprietary metric that someone's invented. That becomes a little bit tricky because you don't know how reliable it is, you don't know how valid it is. But I think we've picked metrics that fit both of those buckets, and it's nice to see a lot of them correspond with what Bishop is saying and what Bove is saying. Because like I said, they're really bright individuals, and it's nice to be like on track with them.
Nice. So after that, last time we discussed mainly about like eccentric peak force. After like these two papers, is there other like metrics you are looking into?
Well, the one thing that Bove sort of, I shouldn't say like opened my eyes to, because I'd heard it before, but he did such a good job synthesizing it, is just the ways to change the metrics, right? So through training, right? He presents so many, examples of ways in which, hey, through bands or chains or flywheel protocols, like you can alter these metrics and the, force trace signatures that accompany them. And so it's not necessarily the metrics themselves, but it's how you accomplish those tasks, right? Is it a depth jump? Is it a squat jump? Okay, yeah, the metrics are important, but it's really the execution of those, and then it's the improvement of those, right? What methods are you using to improve those qualities? I think that's one thing that I got from his book, that was sort of, yeah, a bit of a refresher, but also a perfect timing in terms of clarifying things that I've been thinking about. But he just did a such a good job synthesizing it.
Nice.
Yeah. I
I
feel like I should plug his book. This is Takeoff by Daniel Bove. Make sure you buy it. So
shout out to Daniel Bove, man. So here's an interesting thing. I translate his the quadrant system into like Chinese version, and I thought the basketball team, the basketball strength coach is gonna purchase the course, but after all, it's mainly like baseball strength and conditioning coaches in Taiwan purchase that more. That's interesting.
interesting. What do you think that? Why do you think that?
Because like Daniel Bove is working in the NBA. I thought basketball like coaches in work with
Yeah.
basketball environment would be like more into this.
Do you know why? Do you know how the baseball coaches are using it?
You mean how or why?
Yeah, like what are they using it for? Like what are their, what are the quadrants they're trying to, implement in baseball?
Oh, okay. Because uh mainly the seasons here in Taiwan, the pro baseball season is kind of the same with a Major League Baseball. They basically have to play 3 or 4 games a week.
Yeah.
So before like the book, before the courses, this is what I heard. I didn't experience it. This is what I heard from the coaches and the athletic trainer work in that environment, that they don't really know how to like put in strength training during the season, or
Mhm.
they don't know how to manage the workload.
I got you.
So like quadra system probably help them manage the workload and teach them how to like put in some game day lift.
I got you. That makes sense.
Yeah. But it's interesting that baseball coaches purchase that.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I think Takeoff is gonna change the game in Taiwan too.
Yeah, our force play is pretty popular in Taiwan.
It's just beginning.
Just being nice.
Yeah,
Well,
and
that's where the States wasn't 10 years ago. So
yeah, and probably
a lot
15
of room.
years ago, right?
What was that?
I mean, probably 15 years ago.
Yeah, I guess I'm talking like obviously Fort States have been around in labs, but like since teams have had them, 10 years ago they really started to like take off, like college, like basketball teams, football teams, like everybody has seemed to have gotten them by now.
So this is the main reason I think I should invite you, because like you work with the data like every day, and also a strength
Hmm.
and conditioning coach. So it go back to the first question I asked you, because in Taiwan, like the data, force plate, velocity based training, even GPS is just started, and coaches don't know how to like what metric they should be using. Should
Yeah.
they be just following the data, or like should we be like following those coaches who have like 20 or 30 years of experience, which probably sometimes are a little conflict with those
Yeah.
data shows. So what are your thoughts on that?
It's a really good question. It's something that I think, everyone struggles with early on. You're just hit with like this fire hose of data and metrics and what do I do? When do I do it? You know, it's really helpful, at least for me now, to think about like what is the goal? Like what am I really trying to do? So if you think about our environment, right, the goal is to minimize time loss due to injury, right? We just aren't in a place, I'm talking about in season. We're not at a place where for most of our guys, you're improving performance, right? Ideally, you're maybe making incremental changes, but really you're monitoring their current status to make better decisions about how you will load them, whether that's the weight room, whether that's on court. Um, and so for me, like knowing that as the goal, that then takes me to, okay, I need to monitor their current outputs. And monitoring outputs then drives me to certain technologies and certain measurements to do that most effectively, right? For me, that's force plates and that's GPS load monitoring on the court. Okay. So that's how we landed on those two things. We do a lot of isokinetic, our physical therapists do a lot of isokinetic testing because for them, the goal is to make sure that certain tissues and structures are maintaining or increasing a certain level of preparedness or robustness as the year goes on, right? So they're picking that technology to accomplish that goal. So I'd ask, the coaches that in Taiwan that are young, that are trying to figure out, oh, what do I track? What do I do? Figure out like what your goal is. Like if your goal is to improve, you work with track and field and you want to, improve sprint times or acceleration times, then don't go buy a GPS, right? Go, if you can, get a 1080 sprint or get some timing gates or get something to better quantify how you're improving acceleration, how you're improving top end speed, because that's what you're telling me the goal is, right? If your goal is to improve lower body power and explosiveness, I'd say go buy, a VBT device, right? Go buy a VBT device and dive into the metrics that people in that space, Dan Baker, for example, are putting out and saying, hey, these are the metrics that matter. So what you've done is you've basically taken all this available technology that you're confused with, and at least you're only confused now about one thing, right? And that's, you're trying to figure out what metrics matter for a specific technology. So that's sort of what I'd say. It's hard for me to say, oh, what metrics matter for every sport and every type of movement quality. But my advice to those coaches that are like swimming in data, it's like really simplify it. Like how can you go? This is a random tangent. I was listening to a podcast with Matthew McConaughey, the actor, and he tells the example of he had like 7 or 8 projects on his desk at one time, and they were all on fire, and he's trying to figure out, okay, how do I put out all these fires? Well, when he called up his manager, he said, you know what, I'm not doing all 8, I'm doing these 3. These 3 are the most important things. And what he realized was that by eliminating everything else and focusing what was essential, he was able to understand those 3 things a lot better. And so that's probably my advice for young coaches in Taiwan or everywhere who are like, oh, this person's telling me to focus on distance in basketball. And, Bove is saying that we need to track this on the flywheel and say, okay, what is your goal? What technology can you use to maybe more objectify that goal? And then just focus on that. Don't get so focused on all the other technologies. Just get really good at that. And then maybe add another technology a year or 2 down the road. And then add one more year or 2 down the road, because that's still only 6 years. You're still really young. And you now know 3 technologies really well.
Nice. I love this. So this probably is some sort of like stupid question, but I'm still gonna ask it anyway. For different sports and for coaches who they probably mainly work with force plate right now, and he probably need to like train different athletes with different sports from different sports. Sorry.
Yeah.
Do you think they should look into like the same metrics, like eccentric peak force?
Oh yeah, it's good. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think what they should maybe look into is, first of all, the different types of tests, right? You have so many different tests. You've got a Conor jump, you've got a squat jump, you've got depth jump, you've got single leg jumps, right? You've got single leg depth jumps. You've got a lot of different jumps. I think for certain sports, maybe looking at different jump types and then kind of going metrics after that. So, for example, you could look at, obviously, if you compared a squat jump and a depth jump, or sometimes you could do squat jump, counter movement jump, and get like an eccentric utilization ratio. That can tell you for certain athletes, how well are they utilizing their stress shortening cycle, right? Or if it's a sport that they don't need to utilize that, you then know that more too. So that's what's interesting. Like in basketball, obviously our guys have high EURs because that's what the sport requires. But we may say, hey, with an athlete that we're trying to get stronger, we may make that a goal of ours to not bring it down as a bad thing, but make it so that that ratio is a little bit lower and more maybe muscular dominant as opposed to so elastic. So if you were to think about other sports, you would say, okay, well, if I'm a volleyball player, right, and I'm closer to the net, so I'm going to be jumping a lot. I'm really effectively doing a ton of plyometrics all the time. Maybe I'm looking at a depth jump, right? And so when I look at a depth jumps, that then takes me to a different suite of metrics, right? I know some of these technologies call the metrics different, right? Like ForceDex may call something different than Hawkins may call something different. I'm familiar with ForceDex, right? So if I'm looking at something like, obviously you have your initial peak eccentric force, but I still think that's passive. What I'm looking at is peak drive off force. You're really like more active deceleration. For a volleyball player that's close to the net, driving that number up might be super important, but for a tennis player, it's not, right? Like a tennis player, you may want to look at squat jump, right? Because a lot of times if I'm a tennis player and I'm getting ready, let's say I'm getting ready to receive a serve and I have to, I'm already starting in like this quarter squat position. So if I then have to move laterally right to left, yeah, the force plate's not a, right to left lateral measuring device, but it's going to give you your capacity for ground reaction forces from like that like starting squat position. So if I'm a tennis player, I'm probably not using a depth jump. I'm using a squat jump, and improvements in certain metrics, say, concentric peak power, for example, in a squat jump, that might be the best thing to do for tennis. So just break up the movements of the sport and figure out, oh, what am I really trying to achieve? Like I said, with basketball, yeah, we do depth jumps in the off season, but in season, the goal is monitoring, right? The goal is load monitoring. It's not improving performance for some of our guys. For some of our guys, it is, but for some of our guys, it's not. So we're looking at load monitoring. We're going to use the CMJ as our proxy for that. But these other sports, that might not be the case.
Nice. I enjoy this. So, want to go back to probably the first question, is like working with, like, not really working with, but like work with sports scientists and work with like strength and conditioning, and you deal with data, you coach as athlete.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a very hard situation? And do you think that future coaches should probably be like probably familiar with both sides of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more important that a strength conditioning coach is data literate than maybe a sports scientist is coaching literate, if that makes sense. Because a strength conditioning coach is data literate, who is data literate is going to be more powerful and effective, assuming coaching is constant, right? If you're a bad coach and you're data literate, I'm not sure that like is good or matters, right? But if you were to compare two equal coaches, but one was data literate and had an understanding of, even just general statistics or how, what technology is telling you, I think it makes them more effective. Jose Fernandez got in hot water like a year and a half ago when he tweeted that he thinks all strength conditioning coaches should know data. And I think I probably agree with him more than not. And I just think that when you start to see data and you start to see what is the actual output of what you're having your athletes do, just adds another level of clarity, clarity for you as a coach to make better decisions. So I think, as if you're a young coach and you say, okay, well, I'm trying to be a strength coach and I'm trying to be maybe a sports assistant, I want to do both. I would say, and you want to be a strength coach, right? Obviously be an expert in strength conditioning, but learn the fundamentals of the data you're collecting. I think you have to know just general statistics, an average, a median, like what does a standard deviation mean? These are maybe the foundations of becoming data literate. And if you can get that, I think that goes a long way. Understand, the physics behind the jump so that when you're getting data off a force plate, sort of know what that stuff means. So I think that's how a strength conditioning coach who wants to maybe understand or at least become competitive in sports science should go, is learn the statistics, learn how to run the technology. And then from that point, I would maybe recommend other things, which we can go into that. But I would say those are the first like two things that I would recommend early on, is if you're trying to do both, and you want to be a strength coach, become an expert in strength conditioning, but know the statistics and know what the technology is telling you and how to run the technology.
Great. So, if like this is probably easy, this is probably an easy question, but for coaches who like aren't that like familiar with data, or aren't that familiar with technology, what do you recommend? Like, which device would you recommend to start with?
It's a good question. I think it depends on the population you're working with. I always believe in solving the problem that you're currently dealt with, right? It makes no sense to me to learn GPS monitoring if none of your athletes play field sports, or you have no way to influence how much they're doing on the court, or the field or the ice, whatever it is. Like for example, wrestling currently doesn't utilize GPS monitoring. And there may be a technology down the road that's able to like capture the sports workloads. Right now, to my knowledge, there's not. So if you work with wrestlers or combat sport athletes, learning GPS right now may not be the best use of your time, especially if there's all these other technologies that like are available that can help your wrestlers. So, in that example, maybe it's like you're trying to, just better understand like heart rate, right? Like heart rate's kind of simple, but there's some complexity to it. And maybe your wrestlers can wear heart rate monitors, and you can start to see how certain, activities on the mat are changing heart rate. It gives you an idea of, hey, on our high days, right? If you think, quadra system, or you think high stress days, what are the drills that we do on those days that can lead to the adaptation? And then on low days, if you're trying to bucket certain practices into low stress days, what are the drills, that accompany that, right? And so if you understand heart rate, you could sort of see the heart's responses to certain workload and certain drills and movements on the mat. So it's really tough for me to say like what someone should look at, because I believe in using technology to solve the problems that, are currently at your fingertips. But if I had to give like one, like, hey, if you learn this, it's going to prepare you really well for down the road, I would say probably force plates, just because they're becoming so popular that it's nice to understand them. But I would say if you were to actually spend your time doing something that makes you really lethal as a practitioner, it's learning programming, and programming in the sense of like learning how to write code. Something like Python, for example, it is going to allow you to automate all of the things that that technology is giving you, so you don't have to spend so much time in Excel or in Google Sheets, whatever it is, because you let the software do that for you. So it's as a non-sport technology, but it's something that will really pay like high yield in your career if you're young, is learn how to write code, Python, R, learn something like Power BI. So that I think would be really beneficial for down the road.
Do you know how to write coding?
Yeah, I'm not amazing, but I can do enough to get myself by, make my life a lot easier.
Nice, man. Nice.
Yeah.
Last thing, okay. Last thing before I let you go. You mentioned that coaches should be more like data literate. Does that mean like we should be like strength coach, be probably a good strength coaches first? And
Yes. Yeah. Like I said before, you have to be a good coach first and foremost. If you're hired to be a strength conditioning coach, you need to be the best strength conditioning coach you can for your athletes. With that being said, if there is data in your environment, in order to make that data the most effective it can be, I think you need data literacy. And like I said, all literacy really means is understanding basic statistics. There's one good book that people could read. It's called The Art of Statistics. And all that's going to give you is it's going to help you understand what numbers mean in the context of other numbers, right? So when you're getting something from a sports scientist, or you're getting something from a piece of software, what that means in the context of the athlete. If the athlete jumped their, maximum, that means that, oh, that was their best jump. I know like everyone knows what a maximum is. But if I were to say, hey, this athlete's data point is 2 standard deviations below their average, that's really significant. You should know maybe what that means. And that's not to say you need to know calculus, but like some of these basic statistics, learning that I think makes you a better strength conditioning coach.
nice, appreciate that, man. That's kind of all the question I have for you today. So for those who are interested in what we are talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm not that active in terms of like putting out content on like social media. I've been trying to get on LinkedIn a little bit more. So that's certainly an option if you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I kind of off Twitter a little bit, not because I don't like it, just because I'm trying to have some free time for some other things. I realized that was taking some time away. So like I said, LinkedIn or my email, like I respond to emails. That's maybe the best way to reach me. That's just joseph.c.davey@gmail.com. So that I'll respond to that. Honestly, that might be the best way. And from there, I'll probably just give you my phone number, and then we can text and call from that point.
Nice. Appreciate that.
Yeah.